Hello, my name is Profesor, and this is my APUS history project with Colin Ford. We're going to be talking about the ending of the imperialist era in the 1890s, and we're mostly going to be focusing on the domestic effects of World War One and the post-war effects. We're going to be looking at like domestic social tensions, interconnectedness with Europe, and other super important things. Additionally, we're going to be talking about how to think about APUS history concepts so that you can achieve a deeper understanding and remember them more effectively so that you can score highly on FRQs and MCQs. So if you're a future APUS history student, this can be super helpful. The first thing that we're going to be talking about is the transition from the Gilded Age to the 1890s and early 1900s imperialist and progressive era, Typora. So, first, we need to define the term liberalism in the context of the Gilded Age. So, liberalism today is normally used to refer to progressive political ideologies like the left in the US, like that kind of thing. But liberalism in the Gilded Age is referring to laissez-faire economics. And laissez-faire is a French phrase that literally means like let it be or let it happen or let it do or whatever. And essentially the economic philosophy is, well, in government, whatever, is just a lack of government regulation. And as as Adam Smith talks about in his book, The Wealth of Nations, he kind of lays out this idea known as the invisible hand. And the invisible hands are essentially supply and demand, and they guide markets, and this competition pushes markets towards higher and higher highs. But the issue with the invisible hands is that they're pushing for infinite expansion in a finite system. And as Ray Peat would say, this is cancer. Infinite expansion in a finite system is cancer. So, new political ideologies emerged, such as socialism and communism and populism and things like that. These emerged in America, particularly, like they were much less extreme than political ideologies that took place in the United States. But populists were mostly comprised of Western farmers that were opposed to railroad monopolies, and they advocated for the government ownership of means of production and certain infrastructure like the railroads. But none of these parties or political ideologies were fully adopted, but many of the aspects were integrated into existing groups. So, for example, during the Gilded Age, there was an era of Republican domination. Grover Cleveland was one of the few Democrats in this line of Republicans in this era, and he was elected and then not elected and then re-elected again. But then after him, William McKinley was elected, but he was sadly assassinated, and then Teddy Roosevelt really started the progressive era. He was known as a trust buster, the trust buster for real. And he's really known for antitrust laws, and this kind of it broke up a lot of trusts. But he believed that Standard Oil, Rockefeller, he believed that this trust was positive. But there was a long line of Democrat presidents that advocated for increased government intervention. But one thing that was odd, and I think it's important to look at the combination of ideologies. So a lot of these people believed in increased government intervention for domestic improvements, specifically in the economy, but they were also known for their foreign policy and imperialism. And I believe this is kind of strange to look at how many of the presidents that were more proactive with domestic affairs and economic issues were also more involved in foreign affairs. So we can look at the foreign policies of these progressive and imperialist era presidents. So although McKinley isn't really a part of this, his brief policy that he implemented, like the McKinley tariff on Hawaii, was an example of economic imperialism and eventually allowed the U.S. to acquire Hawaii as the 50th state. Teddy Roosevelt was known for his big stick policy, and he actually did this to secure the Panama Canal, like that area. Um, and he basically just did this by showing off the amazing large navy that the U.S. had. And then Taft is known for dollar diplomacy, and he used it on multiple occasions for real. Wilson is known for moral diplomacy, and this is what kind of led us into World War One. But he also used it to interfere in the Mexican Revolution, and yes, changed Mexican politics greatly. Okay, now that we're looking at the kind of political ideologies held by the progressive era presidents leading into Wilson, the U.S.'s entrance in World War One is really interesting. So the official cause for the war is unrestricted submarine warfare. So Germany kept on doing a bunch of, like that's the reason. Yes. Well, all you really need to know for a push, or at least all that I really felt like I needed to know when answering MCQs and FRQs, was just unrestricted submarine warfare and sinking of the Lusitania, and that was really it for the causes of World War One. But if we look at the European side, you need to know about militarism, imperialism, and those such things. So pretty much a common theme among the world wars is Germany, and Germany seems to always be suffering losses. In my experience with APUSH, the actual events of World War One aren't questioned very frequently. It's more important to analyze the domestic effects on the U.S. and the post-World War One effects on the U.S. and European economy. So all I really need to know about World War One is that Germany lost, and the Western Front, which is France, was pretty much fully reacquired, and Germany didn't gain any territory. In fact, they lost some. And a lot of the borders were returned to how they were before. But we need to look at the Dawes Plan. So after World War One, much of Western and Eastern Europe, well, pretty much all of Europe, was really suffering economically. So the U.S.'s plan was to involve themselves economically in the restoration of specifically Western Europe with and Germany with the Dawes Plan. But since we know that the Great Depression was soon to happen, this actually tied almost all of Europe economically to the United States and made the Great Depression a global thing rather than something isolated to the United States. Now that we look at the effects of that on Europe, we also need to know about the Red Scare, the first Red Scare. The first Red Scare happened due to the Bolshevik Revolution, and this was led by Vladimir Lenin. And basically, the U.S. and much of Western Europe they saw or heard about, oh my gosh, communism is spreading in Russia, and the Bolshevik Revolution is really violent. And this led to a lot of fear, although not to the same degree as the second Red Scare. But this mostly led to a lot of fear around Eastern Europe and Italians. So the main fear was focused around political extremists like anarchists. It wasn't limited to communists, but there was a lot of fear surrounding this, and there were many acts such as many immigration exclusion acts that limited immigration from Eastern Europe. Perhaps the peak of all of this was the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, and basically there was like a shoe there was a shoe factory and somebody was killed, and then these two Italian-born anarchists were convicted and executed, but it was pretty obvious that they weren't actually guilty for of this crime. Okay, so now that we've already seen World War One, we need to look at the kind of effects. So Wilson developed the 17-point uh, Wilson developed a 14 points plan that focused on self determination, and also the most important thing is that it formed the League of Nations. But the United States didn't join the League of Nations because of Congress's lack of support. But the actual individual things are not that important. We're going to analyze how you can look at an event like this in U.S. history and get what you need to know for the AP U.S. history exam. So, with World War I, what I did is look at the context leading up to the war, and then look at some of the things that were happening domestically during the war. So we looked at the Immigration Exclusion Acts and some of the anti-German sentiment that was building. That also was in line with some of the existing prohibition ideas, and this kind of catapulted the prohibition era into like actually being enacted in legislation. But there's just so many patterns and trends that you can track in U.S. history, and it's very important to do so and not limit yourself to the actual events of the war. Because, for example, if I focused on like battles and things like that, this would not be relevant for the U.S. history exam. You need to know about how things are affecting the U.S. on a political, social, and economic level. So let's look at those points again. So political. We know that Woodrow Wilson was president throughout World War I, and then that there was a lot of fear of political extremism from Eastern Europe. And this led to policy that restricted immigration. And then the social effects that the fear would generate would be an increase in riots and such. And then the biggest thing is the military-industrial complex that developed as a result of World War One. So World War One, briefly before this, the Ford assembly line had just been invented, so this was in perfect timing with World War One, because the U.S. government could create contracts with companies such as Ford to mass produce vehicles. So they went straight from producing tanks and such things, or not tanks, actually, I don't know if tanks were a thing in World War One. They went from producing military vehicles to commercial vehicles, and things like this. And the military-industrial complex also reduced the need for labor unions. And labor unions really suffered after this period because the Red Scare associated labor unions with communism, and then the military-industrial complex reduced their need. So there's just so many complex effects that you have to look for. But Professor is out. Thank you so much for listening.